In the freezing winter of 1798, a 12-year-old girl named Mercy Harrow mysteriously disappeared somewhere in the remote wilderness of Kentucky. What searchers eventually found was not her body, but only scraps of her blood-stained clothing and a diary filled with confessions that even today remain among the most disturbing ever written on the American frontier. For more than 200 years, scholars and storytellers have argued over whether the unbelievable events described in her journal could possibly be true. Some believed she exaggerated, others dismissed her words as the imaginings of a traumatized child, while a few insisted she had stumbled onto a reality so horrific that people refused to face it. Recently uncovered legal documents from the territorial government seem to confirm that Mercy's writing was not the invention of a frightened girl, but evidence of something far more sinister than anyone had considered. These records point to the existence of a calculated murder network operating along the Wilderness Trail, the narrow lifeline through the Cumberland Gap used by settlers migrating westward. What Mercy recorded was not simply her own sad fate as a child bride, but testimony of organized killings that claimed the lives of at least 47 families. The most haunting aspect is that Mercy was not only a victim, but also a witness, perhaps the only witness who understood what was really happening. And the mastermind behind these killings was not some faceless outlaw or hostile tribe, but her own husband, a man who had charmed his way into her life and trapped her inside a nightmare she could never escape. The Kentucky frontier of 1798 was a land on the edge of civilization, an uneasy balance between promise and danger. The fertile farmland lured thousands of families west from Virginia and the Carolinas, while the Wilderness Trail carved through the mountains became their only path to a new beginning. Yet the journey was perilous. The trail wound through dense forests and jagged ridges where predators, both human and animal, waited unseen. Many who set out never arrived. Officials blamed Cherokee raids, accidents, sickness, and wild beasts. And sometimes that was true. But the wilderness also hid other threats the law could not reach. Cumberland County, where Mercy's story took place, was one of the most remote regions. The nearest courthouse lay 3 days' ride away through rough country. Law enforcement amounted to a handful of magistrates who rarely left the larger settlements. In such an environment, criminals could thrive. A man could murder an entire family and vanish their belongings, and no one would question it. Screams at night were dismissed as wolves or panthers. The forest itself seemed to swallow victims whole. For men willing to exploit this lawlessness, the trail became a hunting ground. Into this environment stepped Mercy Harrow, a child barely 11 years old when she arrived in Kentucky during the fall of 1797. Her parents had succumbed to fever while traveling west from Virginia, leaving her alone. She traveled with the Caldwell family, distant relatives who had reluctantly agreed to care for her until she could be placed with missionaries in Lexington. She was striking for her age, fiery auburn hair that caught the firelight, clear green eyes that seemed older than her years, and a quick intelligence rare among frontier children. Her mother had taught her to read and write, gifts that were uncommon and often undervalued among families struggling to survive. These qualities, meant to be her strengths, soon made her both vulnerable and valuable. They attracted the attention of the man who would entangle her in something unimaginably dark. That man was Daniel Krenshaw. He appeared one cold October evening, stepping into the Caldwell's camp with the self-assurance of someone who belonged. He was 19, tall, broad-shouldered, with neatly kept dark hair and clothes too well maintained for the wilderness. His voice carried the polished accent of someone who had once known education and refinement back east. He introduced himself as a guide who had spent the last 3 years leading families through the dangerous trail to fertile farmland beyond the mountains. Around the campfire, he spun stories of successful journeys, claiming he had lost only 2 families, and that was early in his career before he had mastered the safe routes. Now he insisted he could carry travelers through without a single encounter with hostile raiders. To the weary Caldwells, this stranger seemed like an answer to prayer. They saw in him not just a guide, but a protector. What they could not know was that Daniel had indeed been on the trail for 3 years, but not as a guide. He had been perfecting something far darker. Those 2 families he claimed to have lost to raids had not fallen to Cherokee warriors at all. They had been murdered by Daniel himself. Their bodies had been left to rot in hidden places while their possessions were sold or used to fuel his expanding schemes. He had discovered that the wilderness was the perfect place for killing, and he was only just beginning. Mercy noticed him watching her the second evening he spent with their group. While the adults discussed provisions and rotes, his eyes were fixed on her, not with the warm familiarity of a friend, but with an intensity she didn't yet understand. At 11, she had never known romantic attention, but his gaze stirred something she could not name. The next day, while she cleaned pots at the stream, he approached her. "You're different from most girls out here," he told her softly. "You can read, can't you?" She nodded shyly. "My mother said it was the one thing no one could take from me." Daniel smiled, his expression almost tender in the firelight. That was wise of her. Intelligence in a woman is rare and precious. Most men treat daughters as little more than stock for breeding. But you could be something greater. For a girl who had been treated as a burden since her parents' death, his words felt like salvation. He continued to seek her out, asking about books she had read, listening to her ideas about the journey, flattering her sense of intelligence. The Caldwells, focused on reaching safety before winter, never noticed the courtship unfolding under their eyes. They missed the way Mercy began to take extra care with her appearance, or how her eyes lit when the guide spoke to her. On the night of October 23, 1797, Daniel made his move. Mercy sat writing in the small journal her mother had given her. Daniel approached quietly, asking about her future. "The Caldwells plan to leave you with missionaries, don't they?" She nodded, dreading it. "That's no life for you," he whispered. "They'll crush your spirit, make you into a docile wife for some farmer who can't read his own name. What choice do I have?" she asked. "I have no family, no money, nowhere to go." Daniel paused, then spoke words that sealed her fate. "You could come with me." He painted a life filled with adventure. She would be his partner, helping him record routes and weather patterns, building a life based on aiding families seeking new homes. "You're already more mature than many older girls," he insisted. "I can protect you and give you purpose." She could not see the cold calculation behind his charm. He saw her as the perfect victim, educated enough to keep records, orphaned enough to be vulnerable, and young enough to be molded. Within 3 days, they were married in a crude ceremony performed by a traveling preacher Daniel claimed to know. The Caldwells were relieved to see her settled and contributed supplies as gifts, unknowingly funding the start of a nightmare. Mercy, barely 11, believed she was the luckiest girl alive. Within 2 months she would be pregnant. Within 6, she would uncover the truth. And within 8 months she would be dead, leaving behind the most terrifying written account of systematic murder ever recorded on the early American frontier. The first winter of Mercy's marriage unfolded like a dream she never expected to live. She described it in her diary as something almost too good to last, a season when she believed she had found security and love. Daniel built them a cabin tucked away in a hidden valley, about 15 miles from the wilderness trail. The cabin sat shielded by old oak trees and rocky cliffs that made it nearly invisible to travelers. Daniel explained the location as perfect for a guide's life, close enough to the trail to meet passing families, but far enough into the woods to give privacy and safety. Mercy embraced her new role eagerly. She was young, pregnant, and thrilled at the thought of creating a home. She took pride in keeping their records, writing neatly about the seasons, mapping out weather changes, noting which trails might close with snow, and tracking where wild game seemed most plentiful. Daniel praised her constantly, telling her she had a gift for detail. He told her that with her intelligence, their guide service would surpass any others when migration began in spring. He spoke of how they would select the best families, the ones able to pay, and how she would help him make wise choices. She believed in him, trusted in him, and gave her whole heart to the task. Evenings were spent reading together by the fire. Daniel shared books he claimed to have carried from Philadelphia, Shakespeare's poetry, the Bible, even fragments of popular philosophy. Mercy, who had feared she would never again know the joy of learning after her parents' deaths, found in these nights a piece of paradise. She was pregnant by December, and felt her joy was complete. She told herself she was mature enough to be a mother, and Daniel seemed tender, making teas for her nausea, rubbing her swollen feet, reassuring her she was special. Yet even in these moments of contentment, small things troubled her. Daniel often left the cabin for days, claiming he was scouting paths, but he never let her join him despite her knowledge of the terrain. Each time he returned, he brought supplies, flour, salt, sometimes coffee or sugar, but his explanations for how he got them didn't always add up. A broken wagon, a trade with a merchant, a gift from a chief. His stories sounded convenient and shallow. Mercy tried to push the doubts aside. She wanted to believe the man she married was as noble as he claimed. By April 1798, the snow had melted. Families began appearing again on the trail. The first to arrive at their cabin was the Harmon family, settlers from North Carolina with 3 young children. They wanted guidance to reach farmland near Lexington. Mercy felt excitement at the start of their real business, but Daniel's behavior unsettled her. He spent hours questioning Mr. Harmon about his plans, his money, his connections, while forbidding Mercy to socialize. He claimed her pregnancy made it improper. She was ordered to remain inside, hidden. When Daniel finally departed with the Harmons, she watched from the window,
His posture, his face, something about his manner disturbed her. 2 days later he returned alone, explaining the Harmons had joined another group. He had new possessions, a pocket watch, a shawl, a child's wooden toy. Mercy asked about them and his reply was sharp. He said the family had been generous, paying him well. His tone ended her questions, but in her diary she admitted unease. "Something has changed in Daniel since the Harmons left," she wrote. "I hope I am wrong. What will I do if the man I love is not the man I believe?" Her doubts sharpened with the arrival of the Pritchards 2 weeks later. They were wealthier than the Harmons, traveling with 2 wagons filled with fine goods and a chest of money. Daniel became controlling. He told Mercy she was to remain completely unseen, pretending to be sick from pregnancy. When she objected, his tone turned harsh, colder than she had ever heard. He said she must trust him without question, that her job was obedience. She obeyed, but she watched through the window. Again he asked the same probing questions: money, travel routes, family connections. When the Pritchards explained they had no relatives expecting letters from them, Daniel's interest seemed to sharpen. That night Mercy saw him circling their wagons, examining their horses, his attention too deliberate. The next morning he led them toward Devil's Canyon, explaining it was dangerous, and he would personally escort them. Before leaving, he gripped Mercy's shoulders and forced her to promise she would not leave the cabin until he returned. That evening, as she tried to rest, she heard gunshots from the direction of the canyon. Screams followed, high-pitched, then silence. She sat awake all night with his rifle across her lap, trembling. By morning, fear pushed her onto the trail. She followed the wagon ruts until she found something that froze her blood. Behind a boulder was a campsite that had been used many times, remains of fires, discarded ropes, personal items she recognized from families Daniel claimed to have guided, a child's dress, a wedding ring, Mr. Pritchard's brass compass. Beneath a tarp she found trophies, locks of hair, photographs, toys, even final letters written by victims. One read, "My name is Margaret Harmon, and we were murdered by our guide Daniel Krenshaw on April 12, 1790. He promised us safety but betrayed us. Tell our families we died loving them." Mercy realized then that her husband was a murderer, and not just a murderer but part of something larger. The baby moved inside her as if sensing her terror. Daniel had used her intelligence for his own ends. Her careful notes about routes and weather had become blueprints for ambushes. Her questions about family wealth had been tools for selecting victims. She was not his partner but his unwitting accomplice. When Daniel returned, he carried the Pritchards' horses and goods, but not the family. His clothes were dirty, his face scratched, but he pretended calm. He told Mercy it had been a Cherokee raid, that he barely escaped. The lie was smooth, practiced. She could see calculation in his eyes, testing whether she believed him. She pretended she did. That night, while he sorted through the Pritchards' belongings, she discovered a journal hidden beneath her sewing basket. Inside were his own records, detailed lists of families, what they owned, how they were killed. The Harmons had been shot in a staged raid. The Pritchards poisoned. Methods, destinations, values, all recorded with precision. Worst of all, Mercy read his plan for her. After the baby's birth, she was to die. He had already chosen his story: death in childbirth, common and unquestioned. She saw written proof of his connection to a network, at least 6 men, working the trail, sharing information, coordinating attacks. Together they had killed at least 47 families, hiding the evidence, feeding their wealth into criminal channels in New Orleans and Charleston. As she held the journal, she felt the baby kick, and for the first time she knew both she and her child were marked for death. She glanced toward the window and saw movement, a figure among the trees, someone Daniel had not told her about. She realized she was being watched. The cabin was not just her home, it was part of their trap. She had stumbled onto a nightmare more vast than she had imagined, and she was running out of time. When Daniel came in that night, Mercy forced herself to smile, to act as though nothing had changed. But she saw him glancing toward the window, subtle gestures as if signaling the man outside. Her fear grew into certainty. She was being monitored at all times. The next morning, her worst fears became reality. Another family approached. The Carvers, prosperous travelers from Charleston. John Carver, a lawyer, his pregnant wife, 2 young daughters, and a wagon heavy with goods and gold. Daniel greeted them with exaggerated warmth, his eyes alight at their wealth. Mercy, watching, realized instantly what was planned. The Carvers were walking into a carefully set death trap. Throughout the day she observed Daniel working his charm, telling stories, showing maps, claiming knowledge of the safest routes. He was persuasive, so convincing that even she almost forgot the truth. But she also saw the hidden signals, the hand gestures toward the forest, the silent communication with the men watching from the trees. His network was preparing. This would be their richest kill yet. That night the family shared a meal. The Carver daughters laughed by the fire, unaware of danger. The eldest, Sarah, reminded Mercy painfully of herself months earlier. Curious, bright, still innocent. She asked Mercy, "Are you really only 13? Mama says I won't marry for years. You seem so grown." The words cut Mercy deeply, a mirror of her lost childhood. She looked at Sarah and saw the younger version of herself who had believed Daniel's lies. She could not allow this family to be destroyed. When Mrs. Carver complimented her cooking, Mercy saw her chance. She offered to show her where she gathered a special herb, leading her to the stream. There she whispered the truth. "Your lives are in danger. Daniel is no guide. He is part of a band of killers." At first Mrs. Carver thought she was delirious from pregnancy. But when Mercy showed her torn pages from Daniel's ledger, her disbelief turned to horror. She read the names, the deaths, the details. "My God," she whispered, trembling. "How many? How long?" Mercy told her 3 years at least, maybe longer. She explained that Daniel had chosen them because no one in Charleston was expecting letters, because they traveled alone and rich. Mrs. Carver's face crumpled, her thoughts turning to her children. Mercy gripped her arm and said they had to act carefully. Daniel was not alone. At least 3 men were watching. If they tried to run openly, all would be killed. Mercy, despite her pregnancy, devised a plan. She told Mrs. Carver that Daniel would suggest Devil's Canyon at dawn. She explained the signals his network used. "Tonight," she said, "I will light those fires myself. It will trick them into believing the militia is near. When you see the fires, take your family and run east until you reach Boonesboro. Do not stop. Do not trust anyone." Mrs. Carver begged her to come, but Mercy shook her head. She was 7 months pregnant. She could not run. Someone had to create confusion, buy time. She chose herself. That night, while the camp slept, Mercy slipped into the darkness. Every step was painful, but desperation gave her strength. She led the Carver's horses to a grove she had prepared, then lit the first fire, then another, then another. Soon the valley glowed with false signal fires, the warning code of the killers. Daniel burst from the cabin, shouting her name, confused, enraged. His careful plans were collapsing. He thought the militia was upon them. In the chaos, the Carvers awoke. Mercy returned long enough to direct them towards safety. The horses are waiting. Follow the stream to the marker stone, then east. Mrs. Carver clung to her, tears streaming, but Mercy pushed her away. "Go now, save them, I'll hold them back." The Carvers fled into the night. The forest erupted with chaos. Daniel's men spread out, hunting calls echoing. Mercy led them on, guiding the Carvers while staying behind enough to slow the pursuit. Several times they nearly stumbled into ambushes, saved only by her knowledge of caves and hidden trails. But dawn found them trapped in a cave, exhausted, the killers closing in. Mercy clutched her diary, writing what she believed would be her last words, that Daniel Krenshaw and his men were responsible for dozens of murders, that they were not Cherokee raiders but organized predators. She prayed someone would find her words and bring justice, but morning brought a miracle. A column of militia rode up the main trail, led by Captain James Whitfield, drawn by rumors of signal fires and missing families. As they moved to surround the cabin, Daniel realized capture was certain. Enraged, he decided to end the only witness who could expose him. He went after Mercy with a knife, snarling that she had ruined 3 years of work. But Mercy was ready. She had learned to handle his pistol. When he lunged, she fired. The shot echoed through the valley. The militia arrived to find Daniel dead, and Mercy dying, her hands still gripping the weapon. She had saved the Carvers, exposed the network, and ended her husband's reign of murder. Her diary, clutched against her chest, became the key evidence in one of the largest investigations of early frontier America. At 13 years old, pregnant and alone, she had chosen justice over survival. The militia found the cave just moments after the echo of Mercy's shot rolled through the hills. Inside lay Daniel Krenshaw, struck down by the very girl he had once lured into his trap. Mercy herself was collapsing, her strength spent, blood seeping from the wound he had managed to inflict before she pulled the trigger. She was 13 years old, 7 months pregnant, and her short life was ending in the place where she had finally defied him. Clutched to her chest was the diary that would soon become the most damning evidence ever uncovered on the frontier. The Carver family huddled nearby, alive only because of her warnings and her desperate courage. When Captain James Whitfield, the militia officer in charge, read those pages, he admitted later in his report that he had never witnessed such clarity and precision from a girl so young. Every detail was there: the murders, the ambushes, the lists of families, the ledger of stolen wealth. It was a map of horror that law enforcement had never even imagined. The investigation that followed Mercy's death spread like wildfire across the Kentucky territory. Once the militia knew where to search, evidence appeared everywhere. At Devil's Canyon, shallow graves were unearthed, skeletal remains of entire families, their wagons stripped, their bones gnawed by time and animals. Campsites yielded caches of stolen goods, piles of clothing, jewelry, and keepsakes recognizable to survivors who had reported missing kin. A cache of valuables buried near Daniel's cabin contained gold coins, silverware, and heirlooms worth more than $15,000, a fortune beyond the reach of most settlers. Mercy's diary matched these discoveries item for item, turning suspicion into undeniable proof. What she had written was not the fantasy of a scared child. It was a record of systematic murder on a scale almost too vast to comprehend. As the militia extended their search, the breadth of Daniel's network came into focus. His journal had mentioned at least 6 other men. Within weeks, 7 were captured, though others slipped away into the wilderness, likely fleeing toward other territories. Under questioning, those arrested confessed to crimes stretching back years. They described staging raids that looked like Indian attacks, poisoning victims to mimic natural illness, burying bodies where no one would stumble across them. Families had vanished, not just in Kentucky, but across Tennessee, Virginia, and the Carolinas. The killers were clever, moving across jurisdictional lines to prevent patterns from emerging. Mercy's ledger, paired with their testimony, revealed the truth. The operation had lasted at least 5 years and consumed more than 70 families. That meant well over 300 men, women and children had been erased from history, their possessions funneled into the pockets of a criminal ring that stretched from Charleston to New Orleans. The trial in Lexington became one of the most infamous proceedings of its era. Survivors, relatives, and curious onlookers flooded into the town, desperate to hear the testimony. The courtroom was packed as Mrs. Carver recounted her story, her voice breaking as she described how a 13-year-old girl risked everything to save strangers. She told the jury about the fires Mercy lit, the whispered warnings by the stream, the determination in her eyes when she chose to stay behind. The words left hardened men weeping openly. When she finished, the crowd erupted in applause. Newspapers from Boston to Philadelphia carried the story, portraying the killers as monsters, but also holding Mercy up as a symbol of sacrifice. On September 15, 1798, the 7 captured murderers were hanged in Lexington before a crowd of thousands. For many, it was not simply justice but a reckoning. The hangings were meant to close the chapter, though whispers lingered that some members of the network had escaped. The aftermath of the case reshaped the frontier. Lawmakers and militia leaders realized that gaps in communication and oversight had made such atrocities possible. Territorial militias began exchanging reports regularly to track suspicious activity across borders. Wanted notices became standardized, circulated between counties and states, to prevent killers from hiding by simply moving a few miles west. Guides, once unregulated, were now required to register with authorities, obtain bonds, and check in at patrol stations along major routes. Families were given coded signals to use if they needed help, and militia patrols increased along dangerous passages. Guard posts were built at points like Devil's Canyon, ensuring no group would be as vulnerable as those Mercy had seen led to slaughter. The wilderness trail itself transformed into something safer, a route where watchmen stood ready and records were kept. For a time, the killing stopped. The impact rippled beyond law and order. Churches and missions, recognizing how Mercy's orphan state had made her vulnerable, created new systems for placing children. The Methodist mission in Lexington, where Mercy had originally been bound, altered its practices to ensure orphans were matched with trusted families rather than left in uncertain care. The Carver family, saved by Mercy's actions, took it upon themselves to preserve her legacy. John Carver, with his legal background, helped draft several of the new protective laws. His wife Sarah created a fund to provide food, shelter, and schooling for orphaned children throughout Kentucky. When she gave birth later that year to a daughter, she named the child Mercy, in honor of the girl who had saved their lives. That child, Mercy Carver, grew up carrying the weight of her namesake's sacrifice and devoted her adult life to building schools for frontier children, ensuring that education, the very gift that had marked Mercy Harrow as unique, would not be so rare again. The cave where Mercy made her last stand became a place of remembrance. Travelers on the wilderness trail would pause to leave flowers, trinkets, or children's toys in her honor. Cherokee leaders, long blamed for murders they had not committed, began attending these memorials as a gesture of respect for the girl whose writings cleared their name. Local settlers referred to the site simply as Mercy's Cave. For decades it stood as a reminder that the most terrifying predators on the frontier had not been wolves or raiders but men who knew how to exploit trust. Even as decades passed, historians struggled with the story. Many accounts of early America celebrated rugged expansion and the triumph of settlers. The tale of Mercy Harrow, with its betrayal, exploitation, and organized murder, did not fit easily into the heroic narrative. As a result, her name faded into regional archives, her diary tucked away in court records rather than national memory. But those who studied the case understood its significance. It showed that even in small communities, where everyone claimed to know one another, evil could hide behind polite smiles and promises of protection. The killers had survived by appearing trustworthy, by presenting themselves as guides, neighbors, even family men. That truth was harder to accept than tales of danger from the wilderness. Modern researchers estimate the true number of victims may have exceeded the recorded 70 families. They believe Daniel and his network had begun expanding their operations, targeting other migration routes, such as the Great Indian Warpath through Virginia and the Federal Road through Georgia. Recovery efforts continued long after the trial. Using Daniel's meticulous records, authorities uncovered additional burial grounds, allowing families back east to finally learn the fate of relatives who had vanished years earlier. The web of corruption extended outward as well, reaching merchants in Charleston and New Orleans who had helped launder the stolen goods. Their arrests revealed something most had not believed possible, that organized crime had already taken root deep in the wilderness of a young nation. What remains most striking about the story is not only the horror of the crimes, but the bravery of the girl at the center. Mercy Harrow, barely a teenager, carrying an unborn child, managed to outwit experienced killers long enough to save lives and record the truth. She could have remained silent, complicit in exchange for survival. She could have looked away and accepted her husband's lies. Instead, she chose to act, to expose, to resist. In doing so, she doomed herself, but safeguarded countless others. Her final words in the diary speak less of her own fear and more of her hope that justice would follow. And justice, though imperfect and delayed, did come.